Welcome to Lecture 4 and our final lecture for EDD 939 Module 7. This module looking at strategic influence. And in this lecture, which I don't think will be too awfully long, I want to talk about boundary spanning and boundary spanners. Probably more about boundary spanners themselves. The book does a good job about discussing what boundary spanning is. And after this video, I will link as well, and I would encourage you to watch it. There's a brief video, I think just about 6 minutes or so long, from a gentleman by the name of Chris Ernst. And he's part of CCL, Center for Creative Leadership, which is the book we're reading. The authors are from there, and they actually reference Chris Ernst and then his co-author on a book. And I can't think of that individual's name, but he put together a video of a workshop that he led involving boundary spanning leadership. So I thought that was a good connection to this. So I would encourage you to watch that after this video. But boundary spanning, boundary spanners, and this is really connecting with systems thinking and things like that. So just some quick general thoughts. What are boundary spanners? These are individuals who connect the organization's internal networks, or really connect the system with external sources of information. And I put that second bullet there. Boundary spanners can be internal, but typically we think of them as externally focused, but they can be both. And typically when we talk about boundary spanning leadership, we're talking more about internal, and the book does a pretty good job about talking about internal boundary spanning. But I want to make sure we understand that there are external we do boundary spanning externally as well. And that's a key part, especially, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about all this, but I just want to hit on these bullets. That third bullet, it requires a systems thinking perspective, both internally and externally. We have to see ourselves as part of, we have to see our organization as a system, right, working together. And so we span the boundaries within the system itself, and we have to see ourselves, our organization, as part of a bigger, broader system. Ecosystem, if you will, literally sometimes part of an ecosystem, but also an economic, a higher ed ecosystem, all of those things that come into play. And boundary spanners are those individuals who connect the organization's internal networks with external sources of information. And they're actually, used to be, I don't know how many organizations still do, they actually had jobs that basically where boundary spanner was kind of the title of the role. And I don't think we have those so much anymore, but there are certain functions, certain roles that are much more about spanning those external boundaries. And then there are some roles that should be, but we don't necessarily always identify them as such. And so what I want to do with this is encourage you as a leader in a department especially to be thinking about even how your role should be somewhat involved with boundary spanning. Because these individuals are pulling in external sources of information. And, one of the things that we do, and I think and again, I'm can't quite remember which course I mentioned it in, but one of the things that I do as part of being director of the EDD program is every year I write up a report. And part of that report, it's an annual report, and I look at a lot of different things, but one of them is I conduct an environmental scan. And that's just a little bit of boundary spanning, really. But it's a component of it. And what I'm doing in that environmental scan is, it's not just a scan of our internal environment. I'm looking outside. What are our competitor programs doing? What are our benchmark institutions doing? What's going on in higher ed as a whole, both more locally in the Omaha, Council Bluffs, Lincoln, Midwest area, and nationally, and all of those things come in. So that's a little bit of boundary spanning, because I'm connecting with external sources of information, and then I'm pulling that information back in. Customer service representatives, truly, if they're doing that role, to a certain extent, are boundary spanners, because they're connecting with the customers, and then they should be bringing those external sources of information back into the system and saying, hey, here's feedback that we're getting, here's information, and things like that. Now, and again, this requires a systems thinking perspective, both internally and externally. Because internally, I have to, if I'm spanning boundaries within the system, I have to recognize that we are a system, and our department is not isolated, and so I need to be gathering information from other parts of the system and bringing that back in to help inform decisions and ideas, and then also using that to then influence both within my immediate area and strategically influence in other areas as well. And then the last slide there that I have for you is some challenges that are involved for boundary spanners. And this can be somewhat difficult, especially if this is kind of a key part of their job. We had a gentleman who was at Clarkson when I first arrived, and then he left, and we never backfilled that position. And I can't quite remember the title of the position, but basically he was a community liaison for us. And so a lot of what his role was to go out to hospitals and healthcare systems and things like that, and find out what are their needs, what are on the horizon, what are they seeing from our clinical students and our graduates, and what are their needs going to be, so how might that inform some of the curricular decisions we make and push forward, things like that, right? So he's gathering external sources of information and then bringing them back in and sharing them with us. And so for his role, that was a key part of his role, was being out there. Now, like a president of a college should be doing a lot of boundary spanning. Is it the key part of their role? Not necessarily, because there's a lot of internal focus for the president as well. And I've seen some presidents that are so externally focused, everything internally is going to pot. But then I've seen some who are so internally focused they never pay attention to what's going on, and that's dangerous too. But so anyway, there's just, for some individuals, in that first challenge there, to whom do I owe allegiance? That's especially true for those whose primary function is the external and is doing the boundary spanning to collect that external information, because they hear so much from other external individuals, external parties, and sometimes they can feel that obligation to them, and they can feel like I owe them something. Now, the organization is the one paying my paycheck, but these people, they're the ones that I really have built relationships with, and that's a danger that can happen with boundary spanners. And I've read some articles about folks who fill these functions, these roles. They spend so much time external that they've not built any relationships internally. And so as a result, their allegiance is all with the parties out there, because that's who they've built the relationships with. But the organization is the one who writes their check. And so to whom do I owe allegiance? And it can be a real tension thing for boundary spanners. And that connects with that second one, another challenge that boundary spanners have, and this is both, and this can be for internal boundary spanners as well, and it's, how do I influence members to listen to me? And so if I'm gathering all of this external data and source of information, and then I'm bringing it back into the system, how do I get the members of the system to listen to what I have to say? Because it can become easy for members within the system to dismiss the external data. I think about in higher ed, and it's a balancing act. And I think, in EDD 918, there's an article that I have the students read talking about organizational behavior curriculum within the broader management curriculum. And it has been reduced over the years because businesses are saying, here's what should be in the management curriculum. And so, but where does, what's the tension in higher ed? Here's what we should be having overall from an academic and standards and everything else. But then those who are hiring our graduates are saying that they want more of this. So there can become a tension. And for the boundary spanner, how do I influence the members to listen to what I'm saying? That can happen for people spanning boundaries within the organization as well. How do I get my department? We've been so siloed in the past, and I'm trying to build bridges and create relationships with people in other academic departments, and then I'm bringing that information back. How do I get the folks in my department to listen, or how do I get the folks in that department to listen to what we have to say? And so that can be a real challenge. And then the final challenge, which connects to that, is this. Boundary spanners, and so this is kind of maybe a little bit of a solution to that, but it's making sure that they hear all sides and stories. And that happens a lot. In whether that's an internal or external boundary spanner, because one person says, oh man, here's what you need to do, or we had this major problem, and we get caught up. If we're the boundary spanner person, we get caught up and emotionally attached to that story, and we can run back, oh, we got to change everything and redo this and redo it because the people are saying that this is, everybody, right? Everybody's saying this is bad. Whoa, slow down. We need to hear all sides and stories. So what are your concerns? Legitimate concerns if you're hiring our graduates or you're another academic department or whatever. What are your concerns? But then I need to go back and talk to my own members of my system and say, hey, this concern was brought up, or this suggestion. What do you think about that? And why are we not doing it? Or why would we choose not to make that decision or move forward with this or make these curricular changes or whatever, right? So when I do that, then I can better, when I hear both sides and stories, then I'm able to span that boundary better for both parties. And then I'm able to talk to them about here and then explain, here's why I think we should, or here's the decision for why we're not doing it, and things like that. So there's some real challenges that go with being a boundary spanner, whether that's with external parties or internal or both. And as a leader, it's just recognizing that if we're the ones doing it or encouraging others to do as well, making sure that we set this up for success, because it is vital. It is key that as a system, whether that's the system we're in, and or then the system as it connects with the broader ecosystem, it's key that we're getting other information, that we are tapping into these external sources of information. And so we have to be able to do this and bring the information back, and just recognizing there's some significant challenges that go with that. So that will conclude my lectures for this module. Like I said, I've also linked after this lecture to the video. It's not very long, but Chris Ernsten, he talks about boundary spanning leadership, and that's more what the book talks about within the organization. But I think it'd be helpful for you to watch that and get some more ideas about that. And we'll see you in the next module.